Hello, so I will speak about multiscale topological and geometrical representation of plant architecture. So I'm from France, and I work at CIRAD, Tropical Agronomy, and INRIA, Computer Science Research Institute. And so plants can be viewed at different scales. That is, the representation of plants depend on the point of view. So you may have tissues that are form of cells, organs that are form of tissues, and also other elements at different scale from cells to populations. And there are lots of different ways to acquire plants, from images, laser scanners, or even manual acquisitions. And on plants, you may have different modeling formalisms and different simulation tools. And there are, in the history, two ways to represent plants. Qualitative plants from the Middle Age and even Greeks. Botanists use drawings to represent plants, and now photo with annotations. But today you have also in computer graphics, for instance, simulations tools. You may represent very nice trees, 3D models, but mainly for having a representation of the reality, but not a measure of the reality. And you have also quantitative plant representations. And these representations may be very different. You may have just acquisition of raw variables like length, biomass, leaf area index, geometry, polylines, the skeleton of plants in 2D, in 3D, topology, how elements are related together, and also dynamics, how the topology or the geometry evolve through times. And the acquisition techniques may be very different, and you don't have the same precision or the same prediction value based on the different acquisition techniques. So plant architecture are constructed of a few number of modules of botanical entities. A gross unit is form of internodes. A module is a kind of a set of gross units. Branching system is form of different modules, and reiterated complexes are a way how the plants will reiterate. That is, you will see in the tree architecture the same structure inside the structure. And plants are very complex organisms and can be viewed at different level of organizations. So here you have a 40 meters plants, a tree from the French Guyana, and botanists will draw this tree composed of cronlets. Each cronlet, you can zoom on one part of the tree and describe how this one cronlet is composed of tree structures. And these tree structures is also composed of a small tree systems with leaves, and you can describe these leaves. So this view of the plants is multiscale. That is this kind of, you have the wall representation of the plants with crowns, and then you zoom on each part, and you don't describe all the plants at the leaf levels, but you describe some parts of the plants to understand how the plants behave and how it's composed. And the depending on your applications, you have different representation of the plants. That is, the roles of plant structure is different. You need the geometry, because the geometry, the surface of the organs, are the way the plant interact with the environment. And the plants behave, their exchange, energy exchange with the environment, and this mainly depends on plant geometry. But you can see also the plant as a network. For water flux, for instance, you will represent the plant, for instance, as electrical circuits, and the plant structure will provide how the elements are connected together. And in functional structural plant models, you see that the structure influences the geometry. That is, when a plant grows, its geometry changes through times, but also the geometry will change the structure due to, for instance, shading or competitions. And there is a need for genericity, because depending on the applications, people will choose a specific formalism. That is, I can represent my plant as a skeleton, as a set of polylines, or as a tree, or my own representation of a graph. But due to that, it's difficult when you acquire data to share this data with other groups and to use these data sets for different applications, for different type of models or different species. So we need mathematical formalisms to have a kind of unifications, and mathematicians promote the separation between topology and geometry, two different fields, and it's very important to consider both structure and geometry as different parts. I will present some kind of multiscale approach, and also it's important to have the same formalisms to represent both underground and higher architectures. So mainly I will first speak about the formalisms about multiscale topology, static and dynamic topology, multiscale geometry, and I just choose a few quantitative approaches to illustrate how geometry can add new things to topology, and topology to geometry. So first, if we see a plant architecture, a very simple architecture from one trunk and 5 branches, each modular entities, that is the trunk, the branch, can be represented as a vertex. And the connection between the entities will be represented as edges. So the mathematical representation of this tree is we call it tree graph, is a graph that is composed of vertices and edges, and each vertices and edges may have a label, a name, and things like that. And the relationship between the entities are two parts. Either an entity is is a successor of another one, so we call it successor, or ramifications. And so the representation of the architecture as a tree graph, each vertex are botanical entity, each edge represent adjacencies between two entities. The type of edges are twofold, successor or ramifications. And it's a directed graph, that is, a younger entity is bigger by another oldest one. And you can store information on each vertices. That is, you may have, for instance, lengths, diameters, but also qualitative information like sexuality, like short or longer shoots, and so on and so forth. And on this, and you can store any kind of properties. That is, you can store also curves, surfaces, shapes, complex shapes that are very important. And this, when you represent, for instance, the root systems at the segment levels, you may also want to represent axes. And axes can be also properties and can be connected to other axes. So we call it quotiented trees. That is, we quotient the tree, we group vertices together, and it gives us also a tree. That is, a green group vertices are connected as a tree. And you can do that recursively, and you will have a multiscale trees containing not only trees but also forests. That is a set of trees in mathematical sense. So what we have at the end is a multiscale tree graph. At each level you have a tree, the level of, for instance, shoot, axes, plants, growth units, and you have also information about what is my complex, what are my components. A complex is, for instance, for a growth unit is the axis, and for and components of an axis is a list of growth units. And the advantages of this type of representation is that you may have missing parts. That is, you don't have to describe all the scales explicitly, and that it can represent any kind of vegetal tree structures. That is, root system, plants, small plants, large trees, and so on. So an illustration is that for these plants, you can have different representations, and it's very, very useful. So now, how to represent dynamic of this structure? So we can view this structure as a time series of graphs, or have a graph containing, for each vertices, a time series. And both representations are used and are equivalent. That is, if you see a vertices, you can see how the property evolves through times, or you can have a snapshot of your plans and have a mapping between the elements to see how they evolve through times. So it's an example, and because the growth is terminal for plants, you have some kind of, each trees are embedded in the previous ones. So now, how to represent geometry of an MTG? So for each vertex, we can associate a shape and also geometrical information like position, angle, orientations, and so on. And you may also associate a model to each vertices. And you have two types of information, either local or either global. That is, you can represent a point in the 3D space, or you can represent an angle based on the parent vertex. So at one scale, you have a tree, you add some geometric models, some informations, and then we obtain the final representation. But at different scales, all the graphs give us lots of information. That is, you can store you can compute a geometric model based on the scale you choose. And how to do that? Because you don't have all the information for each vertex, you have to solve constraints. That is, so each node contains values, and each edges define a type of constraints between the different elements. So you may have bottom-up approaches. That is, if you know you have information at the smallest levels, you can infer and say, okay, because I have an edge between two vertices, this edge say, okay, my two geometric models are connected together. So I have a constraint. And between scales, you have also constraints. If I have an axis, I know that all the internodes belong to this the geometry of the axis. And based on that, we define a set of equations, and we can solve the geometric constraints in two ways, solving at the smaller scales and inferring the geometry at the upper scales, and then having constraints at the upper scale. That is, I have the envelope of my trees, and I know that my trees or my real systems will be contained inside the envelopes. So these two approaches, we use the topological informations to define constraints, mathematical constraints. Solving these constraints will allow to infer missing data in the MTG. And then what we have with this kind of formalism is that the geometry is a function of scales. So for models, it's very useful. If you want to compute, for instance, light interceptions, you will have different strategies based on the scale to, for instance, for computations to speed a lot the computation of lights. So I will now speak about three different approaches: quantitative approaches, plant reconstructions, geometric or fractal analysis, and analysis of plant structure. So first is, so you have plants and you want to infer both topology and geometry and development information. So there are lots of strategies based on if you have LiDAR data, or if you have image data. So mainly what the pipeline is always can be different, but in this case we have a phenotyping platform in Montpellier. Then we have at different times different photos of the plants, 120 photos of the maize plants, and based on this photo we have some binarization, segmentation, and we compute a 3D models. So we compute the geometry, volume of the plants, but we don't have the topology. We don't know that this part, this geometry, this pixel, voxel, belong to these organs. We can't segment that. So based on the 3D informations, we extract a skeleton information. That is, we compute a skeleton and in the 3D space, And then this skeleton, we can segment it and associate to each part of each organs and say, okay, this geometry will belong to this organ. And then we can extract data. That is, what is the number of leaves, what are the volume, the surface of each leaves, and how they evolve through times. So in this type of things, you use geometry to infer topology and then map both topology and geometry. Another type of quantitative approach is geometrical analysis. So here I will show two methods, fractal analysis. So fractal analysis is a way to characterize a geometry, but for irregular objects. That is, if you have regular geometrical objects, when you zoom on the objects at a smooth surface, you will not have more information at a given scales because it's continuous. But for natural objects, they are really irregular. And if you compute, for instance, the length, the surface of an object, and you zoom on it, each time when you zoom, the length or the surface will increase infinitely. So we want to characterize the geometry, and to do that, we use the topological informations, and we compare both the leaf surface with the envelope surface at different scales. That is, at the shoot scales, for each shoot system, you have a set of leaves, and we compute the convex hull of these leaves, and we have the surface of the envelopes. And we relate the surface of the envelopes with the surface of all the leaves contained in these envelopes at the twig scale and at the crown scales. And then we define, based on this, we infer the fractal dimensions of here digitized pitch trees. So, and another approach is using more classical box counting methods to define the fractal dimensions. So we take just the leaves, and we embed all these leaves into a voxel space, into grid space in 3D, okay? And we count how, based on the size of the voxels, how many voxels intercept leaves. And then we have a measure of the fractal dimension. It's not exactly the same. In the first is 2.33. Here it's between 2.34 and 2.37, but it's and the dimension of the surface, just to remember, is 2, and the dimension of the volume is 3. So having a value between 2 and 3 says that the set of leaves is not a surface, not a volume. It's between a surface and a volume. And there are lots of different tools to analyzing plant structures. So we have combinatorial and stochastic methods. So we can see the tree structure are either a sequence of ramifications. We take a trunk or axis, and you say, okay, I have or not a ramification for each element. And we have also combinatorial methods that are used mainly to say, okay, how to compare two structures, how to compute a distance between two plant architecture mathematically. So here I will just show you an illustration about rice panicles. Rice panicles is also a tree structure. So we do the acquisition of the rice panicle. We have an MTG. And on that, what we do is we compute all the structural similarity of this structure. That is, all the tree graphs that are similar are represented as a node. And then we infer a compressed tree. That is, this tree is equivalent, mathematically equivalent to this architecture. That is, if we have a pattern, we'll find this pattern. And what is the game is to compute, based on this tree, the nearest self-similar tree. That is a tree that is composed of exactly the same structures. And so it's a compression algorithm. You lose information. It works only on the structure, not on the properties. And it does not take into account stochasticity, for instance. You have exactly the self-similar structures, but then what we do, we see all the, in colors, you have all the structural equivalent entities. That is, in red, you have always the same structures, in blue, another ones, and so on. And what we design is having the same produced structure give us information of the stage of the meristems at a given time. So these kind of methods are very theoretical, based on classical analysis, but may be very useful both for compressing structures, that is, for seeing, okay, what are computing distance between structures, but also to infer some kind of patterning on the structures. So it's combinatorial approach. There are also stochastical models with Markov chains, hidden Markov chains on sequence entries, and this point is that we need also formalisms to exchange data between models. So in functional structural models, there is a problem, a challenge in the community is how to share simulation models with transfer models, with light interception models, to compare models between them. Because people working on plants modeling are from diverse domains, and there's a need to compare and to exchange information to answer scientific questions. And so we use we develop OpenLA, an open source software, and we use MTG as a central data structure also to be able to exchange information at different scales and to monitor the different models, to have multiscale modeling for functional structural plant models. Another initiative, international initiative, has to be to define a format. Which is not a central data structure, because the data structure depends on a specific language, programming language, and here it's just a representation for root systems acquired from 2D or 3D images to represent the geometry, the topology, and the development of the plants based on plant ontology. So it's kind of standard to exchange data between softwares for acquiring and also computing things on plant root system architecture. And this format has been used to exchange data between different software, compare the results, and do some kind of functioning. So just for conclude, we use multiscale topologies used mainly to capture the plant at different scales, not depending on the applications, but depending on the plant architecture. And also to have kind of a standard to represent plant architecture. The multiscale geometry is used as a function of scales, and it's also used to have different modeling strategies based on the scale. And we have different quantitative approach, but also there are we use multiscale information for biophysics, compute light interception, to compute models in an efficient way, in an algorithm, in computer science point of view. Having hierarchical representation can speed up a lot computation time. And also this kind of formalism is used also to exchange both data and input-output between models to be able to make to share information between different models using different formalisms. Okay.
Thank you. Is this working? So now comes the tricky part. There's Jonathan, he's coming back. And we will, hopefully somebody has already a question in mind. Hendrik, let me give you the, here, otherwise nobody hears you.
Jonathan, this is a question for you. But that's not permitted, right? It has to be for Christophe also, is that correct? Oh, I'm sorry, you can't ask that question.
It has to be for both.
And if I have a separate question for him, then would that be allowed?
Perhaps they can both try to answer it.
Now, so this is a question about trade-offs or no trade-offs. So generally, as you mentioned, there are many trade-offs in the way biology works. And one of these trade-offs you showed is when you have either a few routes which can be very long, or you have more routes, but then they are shorter. Yeah, and I think that happens often in biology. Now you also showed an example where there was no trade-off at all, and that was where you, in the case of the phosphorus deficiency, where you could increase the root hair length, and you could increase the number of root hairs. So my question is, why is there no trade-off there?
Can I answer that? That's not a question for Christoph, right?
No.
You can answer it, but I think Christoph has perhaps an idea of it.
Okay.
How this is represented
here's
in
what I
different
would-
scales.
Yeah, here's what I would say. So yeah, that's a very good question. We've been trying to understand this for some time, Hendrik, like why are there plants with short, few root hairs when it's so wonderful to have long, dense root hairs? And we've tried to measure the respiratory cost, and as far as we can tell, if you make a root hair, it's not a new cell. It's your same cell. You're just pushing out into new space. So you're not changing the cytoplasmic content of the cell. You're not changing the respiration. We see no difference in the respiration of Arabidopsis mutants with no hairs and those with hairs. So in that particular case, maybe the cost of having hairs is actually a risk for microbial attack or something. And we've looked at that also, and we've never published papers because we never find anything positive to talk about. But so we don't understand the cost of root hairs, but no, physiologically there doesn't seem to be a cost. That's why there's no trade-off for that one. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and then why don't all plants have that?
Yeah, that's often a you think with the Renkema also. It's like, it's such a wonderful thing. Why don't they all do it? We have to understand that better. What are the downsides, right? Christoph, do you have a feeling about trade-offs? I think you're
Yeah.
on the, you're on the-
Sorry. In fact, if you see just the cost, you have several ways to have the same cost, and the space of solution is quite infinite. So it's possible to have different strategies to obtain the same cost, and yeah. So it's a real problem in plant modeling. That is, you can't say because you have these solutions that you have answer to the questions, because you may have several ways to have the same solutions, but
I think if I can add a more general level to that answer, Hendrik, it's more generally, I think, applicable. It is that organisms are exquisitely adapted to their environment, but that adaptation takes normally a long time to evolve. And so I gave you the example of the modern breeding has produced a root system with terrible root hairs, and the land races, which have been grown for centuries in low fertility soils, have long root hairs. Well, modern breeders, they've been using fertilizers and water, and so now we have plants that are not adapted to stressful conditions. And in agriculture in general, we're taking wild plants and putting them in an artificial environment. So it could be that some of the things we see plants doing are not yet optimized for our environments. And of course, the environment's always changing, you know? So I think I kind of assume as a biologist that plants and animals know what they are doing, so to speak. But on the other hand, it takes them a while to do that, and maybe they haven't caught up with what we as humans have done to them and put them in a new environment. And maybe that's why we see that not all plants have long hairs and all have a Renkema stone, because in their native environment, maybe that was not the main problem, or, you know? I mean, that's kind of a philosophical point.
Dan.
On the flip side of that animals and plants are exquisitely formed to their environments. Could it be that some of these very intricate features are completely neutral and actually have no function? Or the other way of saying it is that maybe there's not that they're neutral and have no function, but that there are developmental constraints of some sort that actually aren't the actual causal functional entity, but that somehow they're somehow linked inextricably with each other? I really wonder, as we start to go into these really intricate aspects of shape and look at details, how much of this is truly functional, that it does correlate with what we perceive to be the ecologies and domestication. But how much, as we start looking at so much of these infinite traits, how much of this is just chance, that some of them are neutral, some of them are functional, and some of them are developmental constraints?
For instance, for leaf, you have specific constraints due to these shapes. That is, a surface may not have any kind of shapes. Because it has borders, and due to developmental constraints, you have internal mechanical constraints. You have, and this kind of either plants will grow in a specific way, and so the degree of freedoms are not all the degree of freedom are not possible. You can't have any type of shapes because you have constraints and due to the developmental, and you have reaction to environment. But so I think that the space is not a complete space in mathematics. You can't have all the points, but you have, due to specific both developmental, functional, and genetics, you may have just a subspace available and not all the space.
So because of your perspective that the mathematical theoretical space is so vast, and we have such a
Yeah, it's vast, but it's not complete. That is, you can't have, for instance, you have few graphs. You have trees, but not few graphs for plants. You may have you have a quantity of materials available that is limited. You have and all of that give us a specific constraints, internal, external constraints that are.
So you actually
So
suspect that most plant forms
yeah.
are constrained or functional.
Yeah. Everything is constraints based on function, based on structure, based on development. But you can see as a
Also, let me add to that. I agree with that. I mean, different studies have shown that. I was reading a paper recently about the shape of a certain type of seashell, and mathematically there were many, many options, and in nature there's only a small subset that you actually see because of the constraints of growing a spiral structure and stuff like that. But I think that more philosophically, we have to question this idea of optimality. I mean, look at us in this room. We're all brilliant scientists, right? But each of us is different. But it works. We all have jobs in science. But if you phenotype us carefully, you'll find that we all have small differences, right? And I think nature is full of these kind of local optima for the fitness landscape. And the fitness landscape is responding to a changing environment. So what's optimum yesterday is not optimum today. And every 20 years there's an extreme event and 90% of everything dies. And so there's that kind of selection that's almost random, And I think one of the things that's clear to me working with geneticists and breeders is we look at thousands of maize lines and thousands of bean lines, and you see every possible variant. Angle, it goes from horizontal to vertical. Branching goes from none to many. I mean, there's just, in a species, in maize, there's huge, huge phenotypic variation. It's not as if nature has said there's one way to do it. Nature's trying everything, and all of them work somewhat, you know what I mean? But there's not one optimum. That's one of my conclusions, looking at form and function, and certainly in plants. There's a lot of different ways you can co-optimize the challenges that they
Maybe we move on to the next scientific phenotype here. It's Chuck Price.
Hi, thanks. So, Jonathan, in your talk, you focused a lot about resource acquisition, but you didn't speak a lot about the structural role of roots being anchorage, and that's obviously something that's very important. So I wonder, as a plant that's good at acquiring resources, good at keeping a plant erect, because to my mind, those often explain a lot of the trade-offs. If you're good at being structurally sound, a lot of times you're not good at acquiring resources. And a lot of those trade-offs fall along that surface.
Yeah, that's a good point. In other words, I'm looking at, nitrogen, phosphorus, water as principal abiotic limitations, and we have ignored structural support. And that is strictly operational, working with breeders. Our modeling and our empirical work tell us we don't really have to pay attention to that. Now, because we ignored and it works. We're breeding good plants. But I think that's partly, kind of gets back to the last question. Frank Hockeldinger in Germany has developed maize mutants that are lacking most of their root system, and they cannot hold themselves up. But we're looking at natural variation, and they all have nodal roots. They all have, so the variation we're seeing, they can all hold themselves up. So that particular problem for our issues doesn't seem to be the primary factors, because we can change all these phenotypes, and you saw some field data. It doesn't seem to, they don't fall over or anything, But that you're right, if we were going to include that. And somebody mentioned Carl Nicholas at the beginning. I think it was Dan, or no, the guy who introduced us, Carl Nicholas up at Cornell. He does beautiful work with chute architecture, and you may know that structural support was one of his 4 objective decision variables. Christophe, did you want to say something to that?
Yeah, we try to integrate both biomechanics, mainly for IR parts, not for root parts, but biomechanics for the development of Apple tree, for instance, or the and yeah, there is really I think I may have yeah this kind of to found yeah ideotype of Apple trees, so integrating both development based on shading lights and also biomechanics to see how the plant react to the environment, but it's very costly, it's very complex and difficult to measure. That is, measuring forces in plants is not so.
Ruben was next, and then down here I saw. And there,
Hey.
and there.
Yeah, maybe a question for both. Jonathan emphasized at the end of his talk the importance of knowing a little bit more about function. And this whole field has a heavy focus on quantifying architecture traits and how they eventually may affect function or not. But and really interested in how we can incorporate these more functional traits, for example, in roots, ability of exude more organic acids or phosphatases or whatever into the models that you are working with.
That is in fact the model. So if you have the structure, you can use the structure to compute fluxes in a graph. That is, it's like information on the web. Okay, you have transmission of the information in the graph based on specific communications pipes between communication between peoples. So these kind of fluxes in graphs are the same that fluxes in plants. Not the same, but there are connections. And having the structure, so the network of the plants, then you can have generic algorithms. Then you can say, okay, I have some, for instance, water or things. I know the graphs, and then I can compute the repartition of each for each element, the quantity of water, the flux of water inside the structure. So what we try to do is separating the structure from the functions. And mainly the structure is the topology that is measured or acquired from simulations. And then the functions will, it's like a generic algorithms, okay, models, abstract models that will, okay, say, okay, I have a set of tubes, and I have water, and how the water will flow inside the graph, and what is the quantity inside the graph. And based on that, you can add new information that is, say, okay, based on this information, how the plant reacts. So it's kind of, and that's why we need to add new models each time to try to answer specific questions. That is, everything is connected, and then to define the kind of optimization, you need to simulate precisely the information you can't acquire by measurements. So that's data acquisitions and modeling is explicitly related because you need data to model and to validate the models. And based on the data, you can infer some part of some values you can't acquire explicitly by measurements. So.
But it's of course much more difficult to phenotype function than form, in a way, right? You have the root structure, but then it's more difficult to get data on transporter activity at the bottom of the root versus transporter activity for this other nutrient in this other part of the root. It's much more difficult to get that kind of data that then you can use in your
without
model.
models, it's difficult. But for mathematicians or computer scientists, we have we trust in mechanistic models. That is, we think that's a kind of theory. So we try to say, okay, we work with analogy, and we try to say, based on this knowledge, like physicians, we have models that are very few parameters, and based on that, we can experiment, we can test different solutions, we can measure some parts on the, and when we are convinced that this model is a mechanistic model. Water flux is quite well known in tubes, so we say, okay, a plant is a set of tubes. It's not true, of course, but we work by analogy, and then we have much less things to measure. And when we are convinced, we can use it, the mechanistic model, in different solutions to predict things.
If I can add this is a key point, Ruben, because I think you're absolutely right. And there's a lot of the literature focuses on structure and how do we analyze structure, which is not the same as function. That's one reason when I talked, I tried to focus on structure and function, and it's a complex relationship. For example, we've done work on the fractal geometry of roots in multidimensional spaces and linearity and different aspects of and decided it's not useful. We don't pursue that anymore because functionally it's just not useful for us. But I think this addresses a broader point, which is in the case of modeling or maybe mathematical approaches in general, the difference between heuristic approaches, in other words, things that help us learn about what we do not know, what we should know better, those kinds of models, learning models, as opposed to predictive models, which say this will happen. And when you're using heuristic modeling, which is what we do, we just try to understand the system better. We're not trying to predict what's going to happen in the field in Mozambique necessarily, but it helps us learn about the system. And then it guides our experimentation, which informs our modeling, which then guides our experimentation. So there's an iteration between real plants and our conceptual model that we embody in a mechanistic simulation model. And it's hard. And you need experimentalists and theoreticians to work together. I think that's the answer, right?
Okay. This is good for you? Yeah. First row was here.
Yeah. So this is a pretty related question, but what would be gained and what might be lost for implementing the kind of models that you're doing, Jonathan, using a multiscale topology approach? So could they be implemented, and would there be an advantage or disadvantage? Or is that already being done? Maybe that's the approach you're using. I don't know.
You're saying if these two approaches are...
Yeah, so basically, could we use Christoph's multiscale topology approach to implement the kind of simulations that you're doing, and would that approach allow the same kind of analyses to be done that you've already done with your modeling, or would it allow new things to be done that are not addressable in your model?
Well, I'm sure Christoph could contribute a lot to what we're trying to do, but actually at the core of SimRoot is a tree graph algorithm. So basically, some of the same math is built into what we're trying to do. I don't know, Christoph.
Yeah, and in fact, if you see, for instance, water fluxes, you have different components in the water. That is, you have the network. And the network is kind of belong to the participate, the type of the topology will change the fluxes, water fluxes. And you have also, for instance, genetics, aquaporins that will allow water to go inside the root systems. And how to separate both the radial participation in the water flux and the type of architecture. It's not that, and defining a kind of having tools to analyzing and to have a signature of this architecture is also to choose different type of plants depending on both on their architecture and also their functions. So you have kind of several components interacting everything together, but you want to separate to understand both the participation on the flux from the lateral flux and radial flux. And that's why both methods are very useful.
One of the challenges you confront when you try to link people's different approaches or different models or different scales or whatever, like there's very powerful models that exist about how things move in soil, but there's no plants in those models. And there's very powerful models about how the atmosphere is changing, but there's no plants, but we have a plant model, but there's none of those other things. Well, how do you want to build one model that does everything? I don't think so. Because every model is a gross simplification of reality, and the experimentalist is including or excluding whatever they're interested in. But you can develop models in such a way that they're interoperable and they interact, so you have a family or community of models that together tell you something interesting. And that's hard. I mean, how do you link that, and how do you make sure there's not errors propagating? I mean, that's a community effort. DOE is trying to do some of that in the U.S. It takes a concerted effort of many people to try to get things to talk to each other. So like my models could talk to a soil microbial model or whatever, But what we have now is like everybody kind of speaks their own language. It's like a Tower of Babel, right? I have my sim root model, and the Europeans have something like it, but they don't talk to each other or do the same things, and so, I thought hopefully in the future that'll change.
Okay. A question, I think, for both of you, somewhat related to the second part of Ruben's, and that's essentially how robust are these multi-scale models to our ability to measure them, to measurement accuracy? And are there certain scales, if we're sort of good at measuring one scale but not another, how does that echo? Are there strategies for mitigating the fact that we know some things are quite hard to measure and we're missing information? Just thoughts on this. And is it possible to identify missing components? Sort of, is it possible to say, oh, there's some factor here which we don't understand, which is missing?
Do you want me to start with that, Christopher?
Yeah, in fact, if you have several scales, you have a kind of also of models. That is, you view the plants at discrete scales, not at continuous scales. So having to choose these scales depend on kind of botanical knowledge, for instance, kind of questions you have. That is, and then the point is you can measure things at one scale, measure things at another scales, and say, okay, based on my knowledge, my understanding between the relationship between the two scales, I will simplify the measurements to amplify and to say, I infer a kind of models and I propagate these models to the whole structure by saying, okay, I have self-similarity in my plans, and this part is a good subset of the total architecture. But it depends on a specific knowledge. It's never just, it's not magic things. That is, you have to understand the structure, and this structure have a structure that is at one scale, that is, you see how the plant, the architecture is, but also how the different scales behave and are connected together. And this knowledge is both due to structure, but also to functions. That is, the way scales are related may be also very useful to if you have different models that are not completely connected. That is, you may have models of root volumes evolving just as a volume, not as a discrete model, but as the continuous models, and how to link continuous model with discrete model. And then you need have both continuous and discrete representations, and that's why also sometimes it's very useful for connecting models together that do not work at the same level of representation.
I think one of the points here for me, and this is another key point, Chris, you're bringing up, is parsimony. Modelers like parsimony, parsimonious models. The more complex your model is, the less you understand what's happening, and weird things can happen. And so I think it was Einstein, I heard this quote attributed to Einstein, I don't know if it's true, but he said, a model should be as simple as possible, but no simpler. Right? It should basically work. And in that sense, what we're doing here, what Christophe and I are doing, is just a formalization of what all of us do in our minds all the time. Science is the building of conceptual models about reality. We don't know really what's out there. We just have a conceptual model. We don't have all the facts. We just have a conceptual model that seems to work pretty well most of the time, and so we go with it. It's operationally successful, and that's how I look at modeling. It's like, well, I don't have root support, I don't have mycorrhizas, I don't have all kinds of stuff in my model, but it seems to work. So I'm going with it. It's best I got today. And if it doesn't work, that's interesting, because maybe there's something like you're saying, maybe that's the heuristic function. If it doesn't work, it's like, wait, there's something here that we didn't understand. That's important. Maybe we ought to understand something. But we shouldn't try to include everything. That's kind of what I was saying about a family of models. Maybe your model is different than mine, and hopefully they can speak the same language, but they're focusing on different biology, right?
I mean, I'm thinking of a specific example even related to Chuck's question about biophysical. So for example, you're measuring, say, the curvature of a branch of a tree or something, but if we know something about the lignin composition of this genotype versus another genotype, we know they're related somehow. How do we link them? I mean, are there paths to do this where we're missing a lot of information between that may or may not be hard to get at experimentally. I'm just curious.
Yeah, but multiscale information can help also about emergent properties. That is, if you say that you have emergent properties, multiscale representation will give you some kind of simplifications, parsimony also. And also if you can infer some simple shape from complex ones and have some robustness in this inference, you may also characterize these simple shapes to connect it with genetic information, to do QTL analysis or things like that. So that's the hope of, it's not proved completely, that is, each problem is kind of specific problems, and inferring, having multiscale models is very complex. We try it using fractal analysis and lacunarity to have very simplified light interception models, to infer global models, but it's not so easy, and yeah, it's
I think one of the useful things here, I don't know if either of us really talked about it, is sensitivity analysis, right? Where you run your model, you change this and see what happens, change that and see what happens, and you see what affects your system the most and what's the least. So that allows you to kind of, like in the case of lignin, you can say, well, what if I have a model that encompasses that? It's like, oh, let's run plants with no lignin or all lignin, or what happens, and see if nothing happens, it's probably not interesting, or your model sucks. But if something is interesting, it's, oh, maybe we should do experiments. I mean, the sensitivity analysis is a way that's the heuristic function. It's like, what do we not know about this system?
Sensitivity analysis in terms of global sensitivity analysis that characterize interaction of parameters from different scales, right?
Yeah.
How parameters from different scales interact each other and how their rank in terms of description and the prediction of that scale.
Yeah, right.
But then, Jonathan, your model should be preferably more complicated than more simple. Otherwise, your sensitivity analysis will miss out on your trade-offs.
It should be as simple as possible, but no simpler.
Yeah, so So picking up on Christoph's last comments about emergent properties, especially these models make great great architecture generating, and I think that the juxtaposition of these two talks was really well designed. Christoph, I want to hear more about that, what was it, the nearest self-similar structures approach. I want to know how good that is at finding different elements of architecture when you run the models different ways. And, just the graphic you showed us, it was separating those apical elements from the smaller branches from the trunk, but I wonder how much more it can do, and if maybe that could provide a bridge to what Jonathan was saying, that things like the fractal analysis wasn't very helpful, but maybe if that pattern recognition approach, because fractals are great at generating patterns, right?
Yeah,
But,
exactly.
but you need an intermediate approach maybe to identify that architecture.
Yeah.
And if we can kind of bridge those two, then we can kind of line up the data matrices of parameters going into the model, emergent architecture coming out, and function or whatever else downstream you want to look at.
The limit of combinatorial approach is that it's difficult to take stochasticity. That is, if you have a self-similar structure, you will find this self-similar structure, or will find a very the nearest similar structure. But if you have a very variety of shapes, how to take into account stochasticity in combinatorial methods. And so we are working of, for instance, finding kind of barycenter of architecture. That is, having distance between architecture, like you have in distance between sequences in genomics, okay, with insertion, deletion of elements. We do the same for architecture to find equivalent structure, okay, to have a cost to go from one structure to another one, to find a kind of barycenter based on this distance, to have a space of tree graphs, and to compute barycenter inside, and then to find and to combine and to compute distances between architecture. And the distances now is extended mainly due to phenotyping problems. That is, when you reconstruct a tree based on LiDAR data, you want to validate the reconstructions. And if you use different algorithms, you want to say, okay, what is the best reconstruction approach? So how to validate the errors based on the topological errors, but also the geometrical errors. So you can extend this type of distance by adding both topological errors, cost, and geometrical cost due to the differences. And using dynamic programming, you can find the smallest path between two elements in this tree space. So yes, this kind of theory, we developed that to find patterns in plants and also to try to validate models, because it's because we have very complex models, how to validate the model we have, the structural models. When you have a functional structural models, okay, you grow, you add biomechanics, light interceptions, water fluxes, and so on. And then at the end, how to compare your simulation results with the reality, and it's a real problem. So we need to develop some.
Let me add to that just one comment. I think these approaches are tailored to your objective. You know, I do what I do because I want to work with breeders, and Christoph does what he does because he's for different reasons, and that's one reason the approaches are different. And like in the case you gave the example of fractal geometry, we found that it's too coarse. Like Christoph and I might both have a fractal dimension of 2.35. He's clearly better looking than I am. You know, it doesn't give you enough information. A lot of different ways you can build a root system. They all have the same fractal dimension, you see. So we had to get more granular. But there are other questions where maybe you want that aggregation, you know. So I think I keep coming back to this, I guess. It depends on what you're doing. There's no one approach that's going to capture everything. And I think it was Chris or somebody was saying, you know, like we're modeling things that are hard to measure. Well, that's, you know, roots. Who can measure all the roots in a mature root system? 0.2 millimeters, there's hundreds of thousands of them, and 2 meters. Nobody does that. Nobody can do it. Everything we're doing with root models is kind of a groping in the darkness and stuff we can't really measure very directly.
So I have also a question, maybe that was in regard to like how to validate models, but basically like what I was wondering, we talked a bit about sensitivity, and I wondered sort of like how would the speakers like relate the sensitivity of, for example, some kind of like functional structural plant model with the sensitivity of like a real biological system, where I have a genotype, and when I mutate it, then I get a different phenotype, so I can compute sort of like how sensitive, let's say, like the biological organism is to perturbations of the genotype. But sort of like how does this relate to now a sensitivity analysis that I do in my functional structural plant model, saying that I have some parameter values, some say ordinary differential equations or whatever I use, and then I change these parameter values, and I do get now like a different point in my like fitness landscape or whatever, like in this context of this optimization strategy. So how do these two different types of sensitivities, the sensitivity in an FSPM and its sensitivity in like a real biological organism, how do they relate to each other?
No, sorry.
Thank you so much.
Please.
Well, especially in the U.S., but I mean, biology is dominated by genetic determinism in the year 2015. I hope that will change in some time, but everybody now thinks genes control everything. Evolution has selected genes that then create phenotypes that are fit. So you would hope if you're like, you know, modeling the phenome, that there are genes that are related to that. And then if you were going to do a mutational study or something, you'd find the same kind of patterns. But, you know, and this is maybe Chris or Anjali, somebody else would be better suited to answer this than me, but the link between gene and phenotype has turned out to be extremely complicated, much more complicated than when I was a young person. People thought, oh, we're going to figure all this out in like 5 years. No. It's super complicated. It's super complicated. And so even in breeding, you see less of an interest in working with genes and more just let's look at the phenotypes. Let's select on phenotypes because at least we can measure that and we know it's going to work. And so I think so I don't know if I'm directly answering your question, but it's like, I think certainly there's parallels between sensitivity and a modeling of a fitness landscape and then what nature is doing when it's changing genes. But the map between those two is hugely complicated. I don't know, does that really address your question?
Like what I was like getting at was a little bit so like how important is it in modeling to take into account like the robustness of my model? So basically if I had like some kind of optimization strategy and then like you had your functions, you have your like phosphor uptake, nitrogen uptake and so on for which you were sort of like optimizing. So you're like allotting some kind of cost and you say like from an engineering point of view, like this is what nature probably also do, some kind of like optimization for some kind of resource uptake, let's say. What I'm alluding to is basically how important do you think it is to take into account, for example, in these optimization strategies, like the need to be robust to perturbations, for example, in your model?
Oh, clearly, yeah, that's an easy question to answer. Clearly, no. When you write a model, you have to check how robust it is to numerically, algorithmically, to extrapolations. You have to be very careful you're not generating garbage. And that's why it's nice to do field work as well and see, oh yeah, it actually does seem to work. Because you can definitely have models that fail, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah. So basically you could have a model that like describes like very well, like something like point parameters space, which is very fit, but then if you like change the model a little bit, then it might sort of like not reflect reality at all anymore. Or
Yeah, so definitely when we build models, we definitely run them through lots of, checking and validation before we even try to use them to make sure there's not these weird, suddenly something weird happens at this point because of some algorithm or some numerical instability. If that's what you're getting at, that's very important.
how do you do it? How do you incorporate it and like how important is it?
Oh, it's critically important. And as part of building a model, I don't know, Christophe, if you want to speak.
Yeah. In fact, my view of this problem is how to link data-driven science with model-driven discovery, and that's why high-throughput phenotyping is quite increasing a lot. That is, you may have a model based on a set of data, and so you do sensitivity analysis to see if the models behave well, to understand the different factors, the complexity of the models, but you have the complexity of the reality. So if you acquire lots of data, you will infer from this data some parameters, and there is a model for passing from the data to the parameter of the models, and then you can, using the models to infer predictions and to compare the predictions with the data. So today I think that there is a kind of mix between you have lots of phenotypes acquired from different genotypes, so you have a very large space of observations, and you have models that can predict, for instance, different value you can or you can't observe. And that's why when you can't observe the values, you use sensitivity analysis just to see if the model behaves correctly based on the assumption, the understanding of the systems. And then you can link data acquisitions to estimation of model parameters, running models, having values, and comparing values with observation also at different scales. And
this is one of the reasons like OpenAlia is open access.
yeah, exactly.
And you can go and see the algorithms and see if it's working, which is really important that we have these standards. And we have a community of people who know how to do this because it's non-trivial. Doing this correctly is non-trivial. That's a good question in a sense because you can build a model that seems to look really nice and it's actually doesn't work very good. If you look under the hood and look at how it's built, it's got some serious problems. And there are no community standards. I mean, there's groups like in France has a strong community and they have some really good products. There's really nothing like that in the US of accepted standards and ways to check other people's models. A lot of times the code is not even publicly available. So this is a weakness, I think, or an opportunity to do things better.
Should we move on to Mathilde, perhaps?
Yeah, that's just a question of curiosity. Thanks to you, each of you, what would be the big actual question, research question, and or bottleneck in research in your respective fields, that is road science and MTG, with your biological point of view and mathematics point of view, but so I ask you the question, like for you, Christophe, the MTG, what is the bottleneck nowadays, and you, the root science, and also the reverse question, what do you think in root science, what would you like to know what's the big question, and conversely, that's a curiosity question for me. I'm curious. Go ahead,
Yeah, thanks. So for what we show is topology as a different discrete levels. Multiscales are discrete levels. I think that we need absolutely to have continuous representation of multiscale, both topology and geometry. So in geometry is quite used. In topology it's much more complex, and also having some kind of algebraic operators like integration and derivation, but in scales. That is the structure we represent is a 3D structure, or embedded in a 3D structures. But how to integrate inside the structure the time, to have also derivative and integrative operators, but also based on the time. That is a multiscale time scale, 3D space with time and with a scale. And this kind of having inside the structures all these components is to find, for instance, geodesic, but also geodesic is in a spatial scale space, and to find, for instance, optimal, but also with developmental organisms.
Okay, so I guess first part of your question was, what are the key challenges in my case? And I would say at the broadest level, it's the phenome. You know, I think I just mentioned a minute ago, U.S. especially, but plant biology globally is focused on genes in the belief that that's controlling everything. And you know, we've kind of neglected the phenome. There's more and more interest in the phenome as anything you can measure about an organism. That's its phenome, right? And so lately there's been more interest by geneticists in measuring phenotypes so they can find the genes that control those. So you have these high throughput phenotyping programs. Christophe mentioned some. But just measuring stuff doesn't mean you understand it. And the phenome is so complicated. I gave the example of 10 to the 23rd scenarios of interest just in our little research prize. Like, the phenome is just hugely complicated, and it's a challenge in numerous areas of biology and data analysis that we really haven't come to terms with. That's the biggest problem. When it gets to tactical issues like how can we build a better bean plant, I think we are making progress. It's just a question of time and resources. And I think if I was to look, part of your question was what I would like Christophe's discipline to provide me, is, as I was saying, I think one of the challenges, Christophe made a very important point, I don't know if you all caught it, which is that you capture emergent biology from multi-scale models that you would not see if you stay at a certain level. The emergent behavior, right? Like consciousness somehow emerges from what our brain is doing. I mean, that's important, but it's serious. You wouldn't capture that if you just modeled a neuron, right? And the same thing with plants. And plants interact with the soil and with microbes and with other plants and with all kinds of stuff, insects and diseases. And one model's not going to capture all that. But there's no standards, there's no model, there's no paradigm of how we get all these different domains of expertise to talk to each other so they're robust and they're numerically robust and, the kind of things we've been talking about this morning. I hope that the biomathematicians can come up with these standards and these paradigms and this community of expertise that's needed, that we don't have now, that maybe in 10 or 20 years we'll have. That's really needed to make these things work. So then a young biologist doesn't have to become a computer scientist. You can go in with your biology expertise and say, hey guys, look at all this great stuff. What do we do with this? How do we hook it up to these other things? You know what I mean? I think one person can't handle both of those domains. It's just too much. That's how I would like to see the interaction.
So very quickly, so we move on to Washington, and then Dan probably prepares all the questions on Twitter that I heard are there.
Yes, there are some.
So we make Washington, you can prepare.
But are we going to do the breakouts for the groups?
We do that too then.
Okay.
But first Washington with his question.
All right, so you both presented ways of summarizing these complex architectures and shapes. But for example, if you look at questions such as trying to use any model to better understand, say, the genotype-phenotype map or associations between phenotypes and function, I think one of the key questions is whether you can model variation, the phenotypic variation, the way you're modeling. For example, if you come up with a graph that's as complex as this, if you take a different plant, a different specimen, you're going to see a different number of nodes, different connections. So do you have ways of quantifying that variation so that you can push this forward in the...
I think he's talking about this graph right here, Christophe, right? You're
Yeah.
talking about if you vary this, do we have ways of...
thinking more generally speaking, if you have a complex a summary of, of a phenotype, for example. Now, it's very important to be able to understand variation of that summary, right? The structural variation. Then I'm just wondering, for example, if there is a quantitative way of, for example, modeling variation on that kind of tree.
So there is different approaches
Yeah, you take
to
say that you take a population of plants.
yeah, that is, you can say, okay, based on the analysis, I infer some kind of pattern and developmental rules, and then I try to simulate and observe if my predictions match with or my simulation match with the reality or the complexity. Another point is mainly you can't have it's mainly simplification. So each group will work on simple functions or independent functions, and how to put everything together to model a kind of cybernetics or complexity of the reality based on modelings. We have lots of theoretical difficulties because people do not speak do not have the same representation of the plants, and there are difficulties to extract what are the hypotheses and what are the real modeling part. That is, because people simplify based on their knowledge, the simplification will modify slightly and is connected to also to their representation of plants. So it's not so easy to just assemble like a Lego models and just to put everything together. So that's why we try to develop formalism, explicit formalism, just to be able to fix some kind of representation, some kind of scales, and to try to
Yeah, but in some ways, if you work so hard to put together a whole, and then if you break up in pieces to be able to study the variation, then it seems that you may be losing a lot of very key information that you want to...
Yeah, but in fact, the modeling process is you observe the reality, you analyze using kind of stochastic method, for instance, some kind of patterning, then you try to simulate, to model that, to simulate, and then and there is a kind of loops. So you can't extract the loops from your questions. That is, it's completely connected to what are your questions, your final questions that is very specific, and that can be, and then by doing some kind of cognitive retroactions, then you can converge on, but I don't think...
Yeah, in Washington, I think there might be two general strategies. I think it's nice that Alex and Dan put us together because I think you can see the two different approaches here. I think the mathematics approach is very elegant, analytical solutions that are very precise, like Christophe has been talking about. And then, me, I'm not a mathematician. I'll just try everything. 10 to the 23rd, just do them all. Just brute force. And the increasing computing power that we have allows me to use 1 million hours of CPU time on the Penn State cluster for free. I don't have to come up with an elegant solution if I can just try everything. So I think you can see the two different approaches to that here. I can just try all the variants I can think of.
If I'm understanding correctly, your model is based on certain parameters. Right? So I think by analyzing the variation in those parameters, you can, for example, explore associations with functions. Whereas in this case, I find it looks more complicated. I don't know if what I'm saying is correct or not.
Yeah, the SIMRT work is what I'm showing you, and we parameterize that with measurements of actual plants. So we look at the angles and branching patterns, whatever, of real plants, and that's the range we put into SIMRT as an input file. But then there's many possibilities of permutations, and we'll just look at all of them. It's a brute force numerical approach. There's no analytical, no elegant equation that's going to describe anything. It's just all finite element powering through it, and I think there might be synergisms, there might be some emergent properties here if we can get these two approaches together.
But I think there are connections between these two approaches. That is, in this kind of things, what you have a model, a structural model. That is, you say, okay, my plant have structural similarities. And then you run the model and you try to find the nearest self-similar. So you have lots of computations to find it's kind of optimization, finding the nearest nested tree. So you have lots of simulation, but based on the mathematical models. That is, you define a structure, a mathematical space, very parsimonious, and then we try to find an optimality in this space. But the problem is that you can say, okay, but I will do the same for modeling. Rather than modeling, I will define my template, mathematical models, and then try all the solution and what is the best parameters that will reproduce what I observed. But the problem is that you can't, because the space is too big, the complexity is too large, and you can't have expressive mathematical models that can integrate all the different functioning and modeling parts for plants. So what you need is to simplify and just finding simple patterns. And based on this knowledge, you can complexify the models to have more expressivity. That is, to have less constraint, but yeah, more degree of freedoms. But you can't, because the space is too large, you can't estimate the parameters mathematically. So you have a trade-off between empirical modeling and with optimizations and mechanistic models, but which are very restricted to some processes, not the whole completely.
Is this sufficient for you? So we might move on to all the questions on Twitter.
Yeah, so it turns out we have a following on live stream, and people are asking questions from Twitter. So I will ask the questions from Twitter. And I think we kind of have questions that are more like an elaboration, one for each of you more. And so I think the first is more for Christoph, and this is from John Hodge, who is now with Andrew Doust at Oklahoma State, and he's really somebody who's interested in the architecture of inflorescences in the grasses. And I think he really liked looking at the rice panicle modeling. And he wanted to know, he wanted you to elaborate more, I think, on phyllotaxy and modeling polysticky, like the decussate and the distichus and all the different types of phyllotaxy, and the angles of insertion. So I guess it's a question of trying to model natural variation in all the types we see in nature.
So in the theme, so it's Christophe Godin and Yann Guédon have worked on phyllotaxic patterns, and so based on phenotyping, they measure angles, and they see in a mutant of Arabidopsis that it do not follow 10% of the plants do not follow the classical phyllotaxic patterns, and then they try to quantify and to understand the point. So they do some stochastical models. That is, they have a sequence of angles, okay, and they try to predict what is the phyllotaxic patterns and to understand why there is some parts that do not correspond to this pattern, some leaves. And what they found is that they found that sometimes you have a jump. That is, you do not have the first angle, but you have the second angles. And you have patterns of at one level, but also at 2, 3, and 4 levels. And using a combinatorial approach, they found some words that repeat, some patterns, all the patterns, all the combinations, and they tried to quantify that, and they saw that in they explicitly predict 99% of the patterns, because it's just one jump, 2, 3, or 4 jumps. Sometimes 7 at 7 size of the pattern is a word of 7 patterns, but it's very regular, in fact. So they can explicit that, and then there is genetic studies to link genes with these patterns and to understand why. So you can quantify this kind of patterns, understanding just using some kind of combinatorial works on words, in fact, like in the domains.
Thank you. And then the second question is for Jonathan Lynch. And this is from Max Feldman in the Baxter Lab at Danforth. And he was interested in your use of game theory. And he said, in the game theory simulation of root architecture, what form of gain was selected? And then he mentions in a second tweet an acronym PAPI, or POPI, and solution concept. And I had to look this up myself. I don't know anything about game theory. And the acronym refers to the players of the game, the information, the actions, and the payoffs for each outcome. So I think his question is more about how you parameterized the game theory with respect to your root modeling.
Okay, so let me see if I can say something that is going to be satisfactory here. So in that exercise, the plant was a player, and you were playing the game with your neighboring plants, and you made a decision to choose one strategy or another, to be plastic or non-plastic. And then the payoff function was basically, such that if you were doing the same thing as your neighbor, there was a limited payoff because you're competing for resources. If you're doing something different than your neighbors, you had a greater payoff. And the payoff functions changed depending upon whether you had a dry year or a wet year, and that was a stochastic function. So you never knew when you chose a strategy, you didn't know what was going to happen that year. You just sort of roll the dice and see what happens. And then the payoff function was actually seed production. So if your strategy was successful, then you made a lot of seed, and then the next cycle, there was more of your strategy and less of the other people's strategy. So it was sort of, I don't know exactly what the current game, this was done like 10 years ago, and I think the field might have evolved since then. But that kind of describes it in a nutshell, I think, that the players and the payoff functions, and doesn't it? Is that?
The question was kind of phrased interestingly, I thought, because it says what form of game was selected, which was kind of suggesting that the game itself, or all these parameters of the relationships of everything, the environment that selection is acting upon those parameters rather than the organisms. I just thought it was an interesting phrasing.
Yes. I better be quiet here, or else I'll just reveal my ignorance of the terminology of game. I don't know what particular strategy you'd call this. I mean, I tried to describe what we did.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was clear to everyone, but it was a pretty simple game.